All right, so today I'd like to welcome Delvin. It's a huge privilege having you on our show or our series today. So Delvin is the CEO and president of the IIBA. Congratulations. You've
Thank you.
been with the IIBA for about just over 4 years now, I
Just over
think.
4 years. Yes.
Yeah, so a lot of stuff has happened between the last 4 years. And I've seen that there's been heaps of progress in the IIBA. Obviously, I work closely with your team, but I just see that there's been so much growth within the IIBA over the last few years, which has been fantastic, from websites changing to different things. So maybe if you can give us a little bit of background about you, Delvin, and how did you get involved, and tell us a little bit around the story.
Thank you for having me. It's great to join you on this podcast today. I love the idea that you've got behind some of this, Deirdre, and hopefully can contribute a little bit. Yes, I've been with IIBA for just over 4 years. I had I don't know whether it was the good fortune or the bad fortune to join about 7 or 8 weeks before this little global thing called the pandemic descended on the world. So I certainly got a baptism into adjusting and sensing and responding to change in a way that I had no idea was going to happen in January of 2020, when life seemed fairly normal in most places in the world. So it's great to be here. Let me share just a little bit of your background. And you may smile at this because I listened to part of your work with my friend Roger Burleton. And he and I happen to have the same academic background at the same university in Canada. I'm also a graduate of the industrial engineering program at the University of Toronto a long time ago. And I had the privilege, I think, when I look back on it, of starting my life in what used to be called management consulting, that sort of old schoolish type of work where you were taught to think critically. You had this relentless focus on customer need. You came in the tradition of auditors and accountants, and client service was a trust that was held very seriously. And I was schooled in all of that when I was a young kid with a university degree and not much else to do in my work. And I also value increasingly now the fact that in that work, I started almost immediately working on business analysis problems of various kinds, even though they weren't articulated with the language that we use today. And many of the concepts and techniques and methodology type things were probably there, but they weren't as overt, and they weren't as well packaged, and they weren't as well published as they are 4 decades on. But the fundamental principles were still there. And I've very much valued that. And so I went through process improvement and business process reengineering and all of the various incarnations that have taken place in those parts of management thought over the last few decades. And then eventually into a lot of IT work over particularly the last 10 to 20 years, particularly inside IT, working in major transformation projects or working for high growth companies with entrepreneurial leaders who oftentimes do brilliant things, but good process architecture is not one of them in the early days of high growth organizations. And I had the opportunity to come into a number of those settings and work on how to build foundations that would sit as the underpinning of future growth and deal with effectiveness and efficiency type issues and things like that. And today we call that work digital transformation, probably more than anything else, which probably sounds cooler in some ways, but the work itself in many ways hasn't changed over the last 40 years or so that I've been working. So I have all of that DNA inside my background. And I was in 2019 finishing up about 2 years of work on what was officially called the digital transformation at the CPA Association in Ontario, Canada, where I live, which had gone through some major structural change and things like that. When I got this very interesting call that one thing led to another, and 4 or 5 months later, I guess it was, I found myself at IIBA. So that's me in a nutshell.
Wow. There's also been quite a bit of change that has happened. What did you find with the team when the pandemic came in? I know that you all work remotely, which is one of the
Mm-hmm.
really interesting things. So for a lot of people, they were already used to this remote work. And for most of the population around the world, working from home was a very new thing. What did that do for your team? Did it add more leverage? How did that work?
It was a really interesting time because you're right. IIBA as an organization has around, well, today between 50 and 60 staff globally. And we probably had, I don't know, maybe 45 at the beginning of the pandemic or something like that. And it's always been remote. It was way ahead of its time in the 20 years ago when it was founded. I really don't know why it had that kind of ethos at the beginning, but it certainly was a wise decision to have made. It was probably in part for cost management, and it was a very organic organization in the early years. So we were, I think the good news was we were equipped to function pretty much as we needed to during the pandemic, unlike many organizations who had to adjust very quickly to whatever the reality was that they were dealing with. What we had to work on was empathy and things like that. And we worked on our own health in more overt ways because, as probably anybody listening to this can remember, in the early stages of that kind of an event, you're dealing with uncertainty and a lack of information, not just about how big this is and how long it will end, but what's going to happen next. And and those issues were no different, other than we didn't have to worry about dislocation and technology setup and learning Microsoft Teams or Google Meets or whatever technology we were using, right? But we had the same issues around health and adjustment. In fact, when the lockdown started to happen in certain parts of the world, we had employees who were traveling. We had one that we couldn't get a hold of for 4 days. So you had those normal kinds of worrisome things about personal health. And we actually started some cadence activities then that were originally built more to just check in on people and see how they were doing and adjusting. Because even though our staff member, say, wasn't changing their lifestyle, a lot of times they had family they had kids who were now at home. They had a spouse or a partner who was now working on the other end of the table because they had been displaced from their job. So a lot of our early work was just trying to figure out how to adjust to that, and then trying the things that everybody tried: virtual coffees and virtual scavenger hunts and virtual events that at a certain point probably got tiring after the novelty wore off. But I think the other big adjustment was particularly with our global communities, which include institutions and training partners like Agora and corporate partners and a lot of individual members. A lot of it was learning patience, learning empathy, learning for the first few months, learning that certain things were actually going to move more slowly. I remember one story from March of 2020 where one of our corporate customers, who in a fairly large organization, said, like, we would like to renew our partnership with you, but I actually don't know how, because I used to just go down the hall to my accounting teammate and we talk through whatever needed to happen and they'd make it happen. And now I'm at home, sitting at a table in my kitchen, and I don't know where they are. And I don't know how, it might take me a week or two to find them. And of course, that story played itself out in all kinds of organizations. So we had our own small versions of that as well.
Mm. And previously, you obviously, before you joined the IIBA, you were working in the normal environment. So what are the pros and cons for an individual? Because there's the people side of it and meeting and making friends, but then there's also the productivity, the choices you can make working. So how did that switch work for you?
I'd had versions of this, but not to this level of intensity, because I've traveled a lot in my work. I spent a few years 2 decades ago working for SAP, the big technology company, which was even then a very global remote organization. So you were used to having people not in the room with you in almost every interaction. But for the most part, that would be an audio call back 20 years ago. So I'd probably had little bits and pieces of this exposure, but not to this degree. And I think there's lots of things that are attractive to a remote only model. And I think there's a couple of things that are challenging. I think the attractive part is that you can build, I think, very productive work if you have the right people, the right energy, the right time management skills, discipline management skills. Of course, you can do too much of that too, so that you've got weaknesses or potential weaknesses on either side, essentially, because you can work all the time if you want to. But I don't think that's really changed. It's just the mode with which you can do it maybe is now more efficient. I think certainly the productivity side of it is a benefit, especially for anybody who lives in a large city and is used to significant kinds of commuting or the inefficiencies of office. I think the disadvantages, and at least one of these I'm not sure is going to ever go away in the world we're now in, is I think it's tougher to build culture. It's because you don't have as much unstructured interaction. Everything is an event. Everything is a Teams invite. And sure, you can randomly video call somebody on your team because you want to talk about something, but you tend to not do that as much. It's not quite the same as sticking your head in someone's office door or cubicle and saying, hey, can I have 5 minutes with you? Because I really want to understand something for a minute, right? So you lose that semi-structured spontaneity that you often have in organizations. But there are lots of organizations in the world that never fully had that because they've always been global, right? In all kinds of offices. So I think that remote work it probably puts more of a lens on that kind of thing. And I think there's I find a little bit of almost formalization because of that. You do very little informal work, partly because you're dancing a little bit on this high wire between saying, do I interrupt that person without knowing what they're exactly doing right now, or do I schedule a meeting? And I probably default to schedule a meeting. And because I realize that with the title that hangs off the end of my name, if I interrupt someone, their first instinct is going to be to drop whatever they're doing and give me the time that I'm asking for. And the problem with that is there's no guarantee what I need is more important than what they're doing. And so you're navigating those kinds of things. And I don't know what the solutions are going forward. I'm sure the tech players are working on that. I know Microsoft has all kinds of ideas in its stack about what we should do about that in terms of presence and red lights and green lights and activity monitors and things like that. But I think that'll always be a challenge that remote work brings.
Yeah. So let's talk a bit about business analysis. Since yeah, and we obviously won't limit it to that because it's just one major part, obviously. But where do you see the role of business analysis going, or what's happening today that you can see?
Obviously, we're going to end up talking about generative AI somewhere in this conversation because everybody in the world's talking about generative AI right now. I don't think that's the only issue in terms of where business analysis is going. I think there's some others that are quite interesting to think about, although they may all ultimately be connected to generative AI in some ways. So maybe let's talk about AI first, then I'll talk about a couple of others. I think generative AI is already having a transformative effect on lots of things because it's bringing tools to the table. It's changing the nature of certain kinds of work. And I think this will continue because we're in a very emergent phase, obviously, of what generative AI is bringing. But probably the difference between this phase and some of the phases that we've gone through in the last half century around major technology inflections like the internet and the personal computer and things like that is this one is happening faster because it has almost staggering amounts of money behind it, staggering amounts of intellectual capital. And I think that the transformative effects will come more quickly because those kinds of transitions, if you think about it, if you've been around work long enough to experience them, the internet was around for 20 years before anybody noticed it. Now, to be fair, so was generative AI until Sam Altman and his friends at OpenAI decided to release a little GPT tool on the market, 15 months ago, right? That was not new. But that part of it was new. But the transformation in that period of time is probably at 10x or 20x or 50x the pace that most of the other transitions that we've lived through. And I think that's going to have a lot of effects on work going forward. I also think we don't know what a lot of those effects are going to be yet, other than the thin edge of what that looks like. But most of those changes are going to, I suspect, do the same thing that other technologies have done. They're going to create new work. They're going to create challenge for practitioners in business analysis in all kinds of ways, because some of your work will and can now be done better in a different way than you probably thought it could be 2 years ago, right? But I don't think that as a principle is new, because I think that's no different than saying, if I now have database technology that runs at 100 times the speed that I had 2 years ago, how should I adapt, right? And those kinds of changes, particularly in the last 20 years, have been going quite rapidly. If you look at data science has moved massively in less than a decade. 10 years ago, when I was doing data science projects, much of the conversation was around the cost of hardware, the speed of data, the speed and capability of data technology, and how you made basic data architecture decisions. Where do I put the data? What data lakes didn't exist? Things like that. Today, that's almost irrelevant and almost commoditized, right? Because I can spin up a data analytics store in my favorite technology provider with a credit card in 5 minutes, right? So now, but the fundamental issues about that work and all of the other things that where business analysis is a contributor or a foundation, in some ways haven't changed. And I'm not sure they're going to change a lot in the AI world, because those are the questions about business process. They're the questions about context, the questions about outcome, the questions about integrity, the questions about linearity, the questions about sourcing, the questions about governance. All of those things don't actually fundamentally change. They may pivot, they may be pressured, and they're certainly going to have technology ideas and all kinds of smart thinkers in the room, and maybe not so smart thinkers in the room telling you what you should. But I think the core, those kind of core principles that are fundamentally what makes business analysis as a profession effective and needed are still the same principles. I think it's how we need to apply and adapt and sense and respond to those changes that is going to be the challenging year, especially at the pace that it's going to happen and to some degree of that. So it's going to be I think it's going to be a challenging era, particularly probably in the next decade. I was reading one of the US capital technology partners from Silicon Valley a couple of months ago who talked about, he wasn't really talking about business analysis without realizing it. He talked about how in some ways 2023 had been, in his words, almost like a lost year, because everybody had gotten so excited and hyped up or worried about the technology and the pace at which the technology was growing and the opportunities with the technology or the worries with the technology, that they had forgotten that the technology to some degree is only a means to an end. And good technology is always only a means to an end, right? It's never an end unto itself. And his kind of call at the beginning of 24 was, we need to get back to purpose, to business outcomes, to why we are doing something, to whether AI even matters in this particular context that we're operating. And I think that's the big imperative for business analysis in the next few years, because that's the kinds of things that good business analysis practitioners can bring to the table as the critical thinking and the answers to the questions and the courage to stand up and speak about things that are important inside organizational contexts.
I think that prompt engineering is almost like just doing requirements. And I know that sounds, it's not quite, right? I know that there's ways you have to write it, but it's similar. So then my question to you is, if AI is really good at stuff, right? Taking data, converting it to information, looking at it and saying this matches that, and I know it doesn't get everything right, then how relevant will creation of requirements become? Or would we need to rather focus on how to define problems? Because AI is pretty good at understanding structures in problems. What are your thoughts on that?
I would say a couple of thoughts. First of all, we should always be focused on understanding problems. And whether that means first, before we start thinking about requirements. But I think in some cases it probably does mean that, because the focusing on requirements as a proxy for understanding a problem or defining a problem a lot of times can get you into really dangerous territory. And there's all kinds of evidence for that out in the world, right? As we all know, right? So I think you could argue in some ways that if AI gets better at requirements, it will either accelerate the problematic parts of that or benefit the good parts of that, but it doesn't change the fundamental question. You know, and there's probably more than just that as a fundamental question, but there certainly is a fundamental question. What is the problem that I am trying to solve? Do I understand it? Right? Have I thought through its context? Am I sufficiently connecting it to the organization that I work for, what its purpose is, what its values are, what it's trying to do? Do those things make sense? Do I know something about the context in which I'm operating? Do I know something about the outcome that I think I'm contributing to, or am I just narrowly trying to articulate what somebody tells me they think they need? Because that may not be the problem, as right. It may also be just a sliver of the problem. It might be a diversion from the problem. It might be all kinds of things, right? So I think that those guiding principles to do effective work don't actually change a lot. Where AI can potentially do things differently is the speed with which it can aggregate, the speed with which it can render. But as you said, that speed, at least right now in the current generation of work, comes with, in a sense, a higher structural propensity for error rate, right, than other methods that we might have used 3 years ago to solve those kinds of problems. And it also comes with something else that's interesting, which is right now, the vast majority of what you're seeing in AI tools is essentially it's a focused, depending on the tool, assessment of history. And then that of course creates another really interesting question, which is a focused assessment of history the right construct for me to bring to bear on the problem that I happen to be solving? And I think the answer to that is sometimes yes, sometimes no, right?
It's that forward thinking, the creative side, some of these competencies that we talk about in the role of a business analyst, which is to be a critical thinker, to understand vision, to be able to have creative thinking, and those kind of things don't typically fall in the realm of AI, at least in what I know for now. Who knows what the future will bring. So I agree, there's a lot to be said about history, but and we should use and learn from it. We should. There's bias as well, and there's other challenges that we have to go through. But then the other side of it is, do you really hone your skills as a critical thinker into asking not only good questions, but having some foresight, which I don't necessarily think that AI could do. It could. I don't know the answer, but yeah, it seems to me like there would be a honing of the skills for the business analyst and really focus a little bit more on the analysis bit than the documentation. I think there could be a good blend between the two, but how that structure works is still a little bit vague to me, at least at this particular point. So what are your thoughts?
I think you're right in the sense that allocation, let's say, of time or thought or tool application to documentation versus critical thinking probably is and needs to change a little bit going forward. I also think, of course, that depends on context too. The example I heard somebody use once was, if you're building a nuclear reactor in the world, right, you don't want a minimum viable product and the opportunity to do a version 1.5 release 6 months after you hit the market, right? Because people die when that happens. And it's not just nuclear reactors, it's a lot of things that would fall into that side of the equation. You actually do want massively rigorous documentation, right? You want all the things that sometimes we laugh at because they seem like waterfall and that's not cool, right? And I think that, but I think there's a broader point that's going to come out of this, and it's something I've been learning from a lot of people in the opportunities I have around the world to listen to our community. And I think I think this is going to apply in the AI world, maybe in some ways I haven't yet thought through or that we don't yet see it. And that is this idea of holding method more lightly going forward, because so much of our world, especially the technology related world in the last 10, 15 years, has been about almost methodology advancement. And it's actually not even new. It's probably not that new. It's just become more visible because of the large A agile movement and then some of the associated methodologies that grew up and exploded in terms of impact around that. But it's not really a whole lot different than, say, what people were doing in business process reengineering 20 years ago, or what people were doing in ERP systems 30 years ago from a design standpoint, right? But it's this idea that I do some work, I do some thinking, I organize it, I give it a label and an acronym, and I figure out how to market it, and I turn it into a methodology, and maybe I get rich if I'm doing things well. And then I stand up and make speeches about how my method is better than your method. And what I've missed along the way, if I do that, if I'm not careful, is I've essentially taken a good foundation and then gotten a little bit off track because I've instead of building and refining and expanding method in the service of outcome or in the service of purpose or in the service of strategy, I've fallen in love with that a little bit too much. And usually what happens as soon as that goes on is somebody else comes up with an even better idea or a radical idea or an idea that challenges the construct of my idea, right? And I think that that's been going on for decades in different versions of our world. I think with AI, because some of this may happen more quickly now, it could actually even give us an opportunity to do a better job of some of our method work going forward, because AI is going to be very good at testing because it's very good at repeatability, right?
Yeah.
And it's very good at codified repeatability. That's where it's been used for decades as underlying technology, right? So that also probably means it's going to be very good at testing method effectiveness, testing method quality. And I think that we may see a lot of that cycle starting to move more quickly. But I think the opportunity in business analysis is not to be lazy about method and not to be uninformed and not even to be not passionate about it, but to hold what we're doing from a methodology standpoint a little bit more lightly so that we're not afraid or unable to move or to pivot or to create hybrids as things move more quickly and we learn more faster. And I think that's a huge skill that in this community we can bring to the organizational settings that we're working in.
I agree with you. We've gone through design thinking, we've gone through lean, we've gone through agile, and a lot of people don't understand agile. I always think if you're a small business, you really do understand agile because you have to pivot continuously and you have to choose what the best option. You got to make trade-offs all the time. But I agree, having worked in some companies where critical communications, for instance, is really important. You can't just have new releases every week. While you're building things, you have to be more structured and you have to respond differently. So yes, I see AI as helping speed up the information you require to work at a fast speed like you could in an agile approach, but it's not necessarily following a specific methodology per se. It's just saying. And I often find that the challenge with training is that people believe that you have to do it that way forever because you've been trained in that way. Whereas it's another way to learn. It's important to grow your skill set, really, and not just move on to the next bit. So here's another question for you. How do you see the field of business analysis evolving in the next 5 to 10 years?
Oh, that's a big question. And I certainly don't have a perfect lens on the future, but I do think there are 2 or 3 themes that we have to really get effective at if we're going to do our best work going forward. I think one of them is probably the theme that we already talked about, which is understanding method and that idea of holding it lightly. But that doesn't make method less important. It almost makes it more important because I've got to know more. I've got to be able to be more agile in my use of method. I've got to understand how I might be able to take 2 methods and blend them in an effective way or pivot from one method to another because something has changed in the context in which I'm working, right? There's been an external event, there's been a resource change, there's a new strategy, whatever, right? And I think it almost creates a greater intensity to the skill set that I need. And I don't think that's going to change because I suspect AI is going to bring some of that work to bear more quickly than we thought it was likely to happen. I do think, though, I think there's at least 2 other themes that are going to be really influential in the future. One of them is data, because at its heart, AI is about data. And it's now about data in ways like we already knew that in the last decade, right? Because of data analytics and data science and data analysis and big data and data representations and all those kinds of things. It's like everybody has data floating around their brains all day long. But I think AI in the next decade because of that, it's going to bring new dimensions to data, because we have issues now that are not new, but they're coming at an accelerated pace, like my legal right to data, the bias in my data, right? Whether my data is representative of what I think it should be or needs to be or must be, right? And I think that one of the leading thinkers in the whole AI space, Mo Gadot, who used to be the head of Google X and went out on a few years ago, he's written a fascinating book called Scary Smart, which both parts of that title make some sense if you happen to read what he's talking about. And he's one of these guys who actually does know what he's talking about, because he's been inside this thing for 2 decades. He talks in his writing about the fact that so much of the future of AI is fundamentally going to be about data. What data? Is it the right data? Do you have access to that data? Is the data saying what you think it is? Right? And the challenge, and I think the opportunity for business analysis in that space, is for us to be maybe better at understanding the foundation of data inside our work, because there's always data. The question is not is there data? It's, do you know what the data is? Is it the right data? Does the data have the level of reliability that the decisions you're making around it are warranted from, right? And now you've got these new things like, can I use that data? Is that data ethical? Is that data biased? So I think that there's that whole thing is going to become even more intense in the next decade than it's been in the last. And I think it's going to bring, those two things are going to bring a third thing to the table, which you can already see, which is governance, right? Or whatever right? Governance around my work. Because I think one of the shifts that will impact, one of the technology shifts and one of the impacts of this faster pace is that I have less time potentially to think through governance implications than I might have had 5 years ago or 10 years ago, because other parts of my work were moving more slowly. So to your example, if I was doing a requirements analysis piece of work that used to take me a month in elapsed time in some setting, that also gave me time to think. It gave me time to reflect on what I was doing. It gave me time to validate some of the more human parts of my work. If I can now do that work in 3 seconds instead of a month, because I have the cool AI tool sitting at my desk that's capable of doing that work, right? Now I've solved one problem, but potentially created a whole bunch more, right? That now I need to figure out, how am I going to reflect on the fit? How am I going to understand the human story inside that piece of work that I did? And probably a lot of that work has happened naturally over time, to the point where we're not even thinking about it the way we will now need to think about it going forward.
Yeah. I think it's really important, because data has been problematic almost from the beginning, because we've entered data over the decades, and not all of the data has been good. Some of it's old, some of it's misrepresented, some of it's duplicated, some of it has more priority than others when it shouldn't, and that kind of thing. So yes, that is a real risk. And I hear you when you say having time to reflect on that would be really important, because you really have to dig deep. I almost say that for me, business analysts are like investigative journalists, right? Getting access to information really quickly is great. As an investigative journalist, I would expect you to really dig deep and try unravel the story, rather than just focusing, let's say, on whatever you were told at the time, but really dig a little bit deeper. That's the easiest way. When people say, what do you do as a business analyst? That's usually the answer that I give.
I think it's a great metaphor. And I think it also, if you think about that, in addition to those dimensions, it also brings a couple of other dimensions to the table, which I think have always been important in business analysis, but now they may become more necessary. One of them is courage, like the courage to stand up and say, there's something not right here. There's something that we seem to be off track. Or, yes, we can get that deliverable, but there's something problematic with the input. And that problematic thing might be, I've got an ethical issue with the data, or I don't understand the data, or I'm not sure that we know the lineage of this data sufficiently well in order to draw the conclusion that we're now about to do something about. All of that, those are the same things that an investigative journalist would go through with their facts, with their storyline, right? With the construct of whatever it is they're trying to understand. But that also means that at a certain point, if I'm doing my work well and professionally, I have got to have both the skill and the courage to stand up to my leaders, right? And say, we need to stop, or we need to check, or we need to double back on this particular piece of work and figure out whether it actually is saying what we're saying. And as I said a minute ago, when the world is moving really slowly, you actually have capacity to do that in sort of natural ways. If the world is now moving much more quickly, and I've got tools doing things, so to speak, instantly, right? I've got to build a new skill set that both teaches me how to do that kind of work in a different way, but also gives me the ability to stand up in those moments of crisis or opportunity and do my work as a professional.
Do you think, considering that, because courage is very subjective to different people in different environments and for different reasons, but do you think there's a way in which, like let's say you're making a recommendation on a particular project or you're saying something, what would you put in that toolbox to build up the courage? In other words, you arrive in with your armor and your information. What would you put if a business analyst was to say to the business, I recommend that we do this, or one of these three things?
I would want lineage. I think in the new world, I would want lineage and referenceability in my data to some degree, depending on the weight of the challenge that sits in front of me. I would want to have good contextual understanding of what I'm doing in the broader setting in which I happen to be doing that work. And I don't think that's not a new skill in business analysis, and it's talked about actively in both our literature and lots of other literature. I think the question there is not, is that important, but are we paying enough attention to that in our work? And I think that I absolutely want to have that in, and I think also in the world that we're now in, I think business analysis practitioners have an opportunity to learn how to respectfully challenge, respectfully push back, respectfully ask a few more questions, because they have an ability that others inside the conversation don't necessarily have, which is both tools and context and opportunity to look at the bigger picture of what it is we're trying to do. Because they're not, say, coding, although coding's not that. Coding has dimensions of that, or whatever functional example you might want to use, right? In the business analysis work, you're trying to relate the artifact, the thing that you're doing, to something beyond just what sits on that figurative piece of paper. And I think that also means that comes with responsibility. It also comes with opportunity. And I think that in my toolbox, I want to be thinking about those kinds of things in the work that I do, to the best of my ability and to the weight of the situation, because some of this might be a 10-minute meeting, some of this might be a 1-year initiative, right? So it's not that the solution is going to be the same in each of those settings. It's that the skills that I'm drawing from and trying to respond or adjust to the context are still in some ways a lot of those same kinds of skills that have existed in the artifacts of our world for decades.
Yeah. So let's perhaps go to the role. And I want to just bring in a question here around the relationship between business architecture and business analysis. How do you see those two working together? Just throw that in there.
I've had this conversation with Roger Burlton a few times, who we
know.
both know, and who has done a lot of tremendous work. And I know his core analogy, particularly in his last book, is about connecting the dots. So I think there's several answers to this question, probably. One is that connecting the dots still needs an understanding of what those dots are, and what's inside them. I think that exists on one level. Roger's also, in conversations I've had with him, said, in some ways, there isn't a difference between the two. There's simply different ways of looking at the same fundamental questions, possibly with variations of scale or scope or complexity or rigor, right? In the sense that business architecture implies a more comprehensive, holistic view of an enterprise. But I don't think business analysis excludes that. I think it depends more on the context. I know lots of people in business analysis who are working effectively at an architecture level in their thinking. So I think there might even be another way to look at it, which is when business analysis is doing its best work, there's not as much difference between the two as we think. Maybe I haven't asked Raja this question. Maybe when business analysis isn't doing its best work, we need more architecture to help keep it aligned and oriented towards its foundation and its purpose and how those dots connect. But those might be a few ideas. I think there's maybe more similarity than difference. And we also have to be careful not to try and package either one of those into its own version of a method, right? Because then I think we get off track too.
Yeah, I think that although there's different purposes, the skill set is very similar, and that's important. I use investigative journalist because it's an easy way to understand investigating a specific thing, really trying to deep dive into something that needs a resolution. Whereas with architecture, I would see it more as understand the state of being and the state of where it could be, and less of the investigative structures as such. So it's more around the design of the organization. And I know in requirements, we do requirements and designs. And so BAs do both anyway, but I see more micro designs versus the macro designs in the architecture. But there's a very natural relationship between the two roles. It really just depends on the purpose of what the business is needing, but the skill sets is very similar, very similar.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, so could you share some advice or lessons learned for professionals entering the field? So I'm sure you get a lot of questions for people wanting to become business analysts, and I'm sure you also get questions from friends and family going, "What is a business analyst?"
Yes.
Those normal
the hardest
questions.
to define profession in the world in some ways, right? Yeah, I think we've touched on some of them already. I would say, and I think there's no question that at a certain level you need critical thinking skills, and I think some of that is learnable. Some of it's learnable in educational contexts. Some of it is learned through work, through time, through mistakes. But I think critical thinking is very important in this work. I think curiosity is. I think the ability to listen in a structured way is too, because a lot of times in the work that we're doing, you're trying to get inside the first answer that you're given, so to speak. Is that the right answer? Is it the best answer? Is it really what we're trying to get to? And of course, that can be done in good ways and not good ways, right? It can become overbearing, and you can slow down something more than it needs to. And the only thing worse than slowing it down is speeding it up when it needs to slow down. So I think there's all those sort of calls about pace are really important as competencies. I have two, I think, that I've been kicking around my brain for the last little while. They're a little bit non-traditional, but it's funny. I've seen them in lots of ways in the last couple of years. The first is a basic understanding of finance, because everything that we do in business analysis, sooner or later, has a context of an initiative, of a budget, of a profit and loss statement. And I think that I run into a lot of practitioners who struggle with that. And because what they're sort of not paying attention to is their work will ultimately exist in some kind of quantitative context for the organization that they're doing it for, no matter what they're doing, right? There may be different levels of detail and rigor and all that kind of things. But I was thinking, I don't know if this is an answer to the question in a different way. 15 years after I left university with my engineering degree, I had only one textbook still in my bookcase from university, and it was my accounting textbook, because I took a few accounting courses, and I learned some things. And it's a very enduring skill. And there's a lot of things that you can do at a very basic level that I think will help, because they'll give you credibility in the room. They'll give you, when you're, especially since ultimately it's chief financial officers and chief executives who are making go, no go decisions on things. And regardless of how much money is at the table, there's always something that is quantitatively economic in a decision, because that's the world that we operate in. And I think, so that's one maybe non-traditional one. I think the other one is, and this is what I've been reading about recently, I think this is true of probably all leadership, but I think it's particularly valuable in business analysis context. And that's what some people are now calling a non-anxious presence. I've read, originally came out of a sociologist, I think, in the US, but it's been picked up by some other writers in various contexts. And it's this idea that I'm now co-opting for business analysis because I haven't read anybody else writing it this way, but I've talked to a few people that saying that we have the opportunity to be that non-anxious presence in the room when we are doing our work. That's
almost stoic.
Yeah, and it's got courage in it. It's probably got skill. It's got wisdom. It's got the ability to stand up and speak the truth in the context, right? But do it in a way that is respectful. Do it in a way that leaders will want to pay attention to. I know somebody in Australia who said a couple of years ago, he said, good leaders are fundamentally looking for somebody to tell them the truth because they have, by implication, too many people in their organizations that are doing something other than that. And they will know that. They will pick up on that. They will come back to that person. And I think the natural skill set of business analysis and the natural work that we are doing puts us in those settings all the time because of what we're being tasked with doing on a day-to-day basis. I don't think that's the challenge. I think the challenge is, are we willing to stand up in a non-anxious way and tell the truth when the setting warrants it, right? When the opportunity, right?
Yeah. Could be harder than it might be perceived.
Oh, yeah. Sure. It's going to be harder with energetic leaders. It's going to be harder with cool and exciting initiatives, right? It's going to be harder with AI because AI will render things that look like they're solid, right?
Yeah.
And now your question is, are they as solid as they look? And depending on how you answer that question, is now the time for me to stand up and ask a question or say we need to stop or we need to check or we need to go back? Because those are they're loaded questions, right? But if they're done well, I think there's even more value and more potential impact and more contribution that this little profession can bring to the organizations that we work for.
How would a business identify someone with that specific skill? If you go into a job, how would they know that there's that level of, I don't want to use the term trustworthiness because that can be too wide, but that level of honesty around the insight that they may or may not want to hear? How could you position yourself that way? Because it's not really a measurable thing until the person has experienced that time with you. So how would you pitch that?
I think it's a really good question. I don't think it has a simple answer, but I think parts of the answer might be, I think good leaders, what makes good leaders? That's one of the things that they have built. They've built a skill to discern. Because think about leadership in any kind of context, to some degree, part of being a leader of anything is you're presented with all kinds of things constantly, decisions, information, challenges, opportunities, and you have to be, even if you're not leading the decision making, ultimately you're accountable for the decision making because of the role that you have. So you're trying to navigate what different people are saying to you or what different proposals are offering or different analysis is giving you. That's partly why data becomes so important in some of these conversations. But at the end of the day, I think part of being a good leader is discerning the story that I'm being told. And I think there are tactics that you often see good leaders using, and I've learned from a number of great leaders in my career. One of them is show me the data, and then show me the lineage to your thinking, and then maybe show me how you weighed these two options. What was your thought process, which is a critical thinking skill, right? How did you make that decision between A and B, right? And I think those are some of those skills actually, by the way, are quite, we think of them as ordinary because some of them are sitting in the big orange textbook that BA built with the community over a decade of work, right? But they look, it's almost like they look less strategic in there than they probably actually are, because those are the things I think that leaders are either overtly or intuitively looking at inside the work that they're presented with. Because fundamentally, I remember years ago, I was doing something in an organizational setting, and I was in a meeting with my CEO, and he asked me a question. I knew the question he was going to ask me, and I tried to lay out two options because I hadn't really decided which was better. I thought They needed to be weighed carefully. And probably ultimately, I thought the leader, the CEO, needed to make the decision instead of me. And he cut me off in the middle of the conversation impatiently. And he said, I don't have time for, in effect, for your two choices. He said, I need you to tell me what you would do and why. And it was a really interesting learning moment, right? Because it helped me realize I had to get better at my own work, so to speak. But I also had to be willing to stand up and take a position on those two options rather than just defaulting to deferring it to somebody who happened to be more senior or had the CEO title. And I think in business analysis, you're in those moments every day. The question is, are you recognizing them for what they are? And are you doing your best work? Because they're not that big and they're not that dramatic and they're not always with a CEO. But I think the underlying work principles and the underlying techniques and ultimately the tools that you're using are still the same, right? It's, do I go here? Do I go here? Do I stop and dig down on this one? All the same kinds of things still apply.
So one last question. It's my favorite question. So if you could go back in time to your younger self and give yourself some advice, what would it be?
Yeah, thank you for letting me know about this question up front, because it forced me to think about it in a little bit of a different way. So here's my answer as we wrap up. I've had the privilege of working for some really great leaders who I learned from. They were the people that hired me, that took a chance on me, that taught me, a couple cases that fired me because the setting didn't work out or whatever reasons. And I think until in the younger self, I looked at those things more tactically. And I looked at me. What did I do wrong? What did I do? How could I do better? And that's good, right? I looked at them in terms of saying they gave me an opportunity, or they were smarter than me on this issue, or they were wiser than me on this issue. But I didn't really look at leaders and the way I now look at them, the ones that I interact with in the more recent part of my career. I didn't look at them as to study their leadership. What are they doing? How do they model things that are important, like humility and integrity and cadence and decision making? In other words, I wasn't a student of my leaders then as I try to be now. What can I learn? And I don't do this perfectly. I still make lots of mistakes, but I have a different mindset, almost a different worldview in terms of the people that I'm interacting with now, because I want to do all the things I did and when the younger me was there. But now somebody once said to me, the world is out of good leaders and not so good leaders. And the person who was saying that to me said, spend your time with good leaders, which is one of those simple things, but learn from them, study them, become a student of leadership, because all of us lead. The only difference between any of us is really the context and the scope and maybe a little sometimes the pace, but we're all leading. We're leading at something. And we can all learn from the people that are around us. So I try to do that a little bit better now than the younger self of me probably did.
Thank you. Thanks, Delvin. I think it's been a wonderful discussion. And when we spoke in the beginning, what's really nice is just the free flow of the conversation between you, which means it's deeply entrenched, and that's really great. So if anyone wants to get in touch with you, I know that you have the BBC coming up.
Feel free to reach out to me. My IIBA email must be in the public domain now. It's around there, but it's quite straightforward. delvin.fletcher@iiba.org. Happy to dialogue to the best of my ability with any setting that might be helpful to anybody who's listening to this. Thank you for the invitation. It's been great to be with you.
Yeah, that's great. And are you active on LinkedIn at all?
I am on LinkedIn. I am not active. Mostly
okay.
IIBA's LinkedIn site, LinkedIn Lead, is a much better place to learn about what IIBA is doing than I am a little bit active, but I don't spend tons of time, mostly because I got a lot of other things going on and probably don't have the time to spend a lot of time there. But I read a lot on LinkedIn. I write very little.
Okay, so if anyone wants to get hold of you, you've given them your email, so that's fantastic. Thank you so much for your interview. I'm super, super happy to have you join us in this session. And best, I know you're a guest speaker at the BBC as well. What is your topic, by the way?
I forget the official title, but the unofficial title is AI is not about technology.
Okay, nice.
It's actually it'll cover a few of the things we've touched on in this conversation today. And I think hopefully some of what I think are the challenges and the opportunities and a bit of the call to action for us as a profession in the world that is unfolding as we speak and probably will continue to unfold pretty rapidly, at least in this decade, if not beyond. So I'm going to try to touch on a few things that I'm learning there and what I think we can get better at from the standpoint of our craft as a profession.
Awesome. So thank you very much. And
Thank you.
I'll end the session now.